So, welcome everybody to this session. I put standards in the title. Jos warned me not to do this. Actually, when we thought about the session title, Jos was strongly opposing of having standards in the session title because he thought we wouldn't get as many people as we had now. And when you talk about standards, it's usually, so we have actually lots of standards, proposals for standards for interoperability in the area of privacy. And then there is this saying, when you have lots of standards, you want to integrate them with the new standards, and then you have just one more standard proposal. So my talk is a bit about how we can avoid this, hopefully, in a specific use case area. And it's together with Pen, who will also tell us more about specific use cases from a project we're doing. So this project is what I talked about last year. It's called Special, and the idea is that we build a scalable infrastructure for checking transparency and consent, and this should also, of course, be interoperable and usable in many use cases. So when we talk about what use cases we want to address here, so this is a large EU project which is now halfway through, more or less. We are expecting our midterm review next week. And when we talk about use cases, we talk about roles and different roles which address these use cases. So this is, I think, what you've seen in Jos' introductory slides if you've been to the interoperability session, where in data privacy controls there is always different roles, the data subject, the companies, and the regulators, of course. So we have this picture, which is essentially the same in our project proposal. So we want to address companies. So we want to make it easier for companies to ensure regulatory compliance. Also for small and big companies, we want to make it easier for regulators to check and enforce GDPR, even if consent, for instance, was dynamic. And we want to make it easier for data subjects to maybe get more closer towards the idea of more data, to basically have personal control over the data and get from something what is now data, mainly data collection, to something like data donation, which we'll hear in a separate talk in the second half of the session, which has a specific use case on that. So what we understand, why this session is called semantic interoperability, so I thought I should talk a bit about what I understand on semantics. So actually not really much magic. What I mean with semantics is common understanding on core concepts. So basically, what I think we need for getting a decent level of interoperability going is to agree on core components of personal data processing, and then think about how we can build basic taxonomies and vocabularies to describe those. And then build on top of that automated ways to implement and monitor GDPR compliance checking. And our approach, which we follow in the project, will be introduced to you later in the talk by Ben. So what's the room for standardization here? It's A, standard vocabularies, and it's B, standard architectures and algorithms for checking such a compliance. So we're in these levels which were shown by Jos in the introductory section. We're more or less operating here on the level of syntactic format to interchange these and describe in a machine readable way. The logs of processing data, purposes, and handling data, and also consent given, and also to some extent the regulatory norms that are, for instance, in GDPR. So, and then we of course need a way to basically ensure that also this is basically describes in a understandable manner, like checked by lawyers, what these concepts, machine readable concepts mean. So when we think about core components of personal data processing, and particularly in the context of transparency and compliance checking, we talk about essentially policies that need to be described. Privacy policies, consent, so the regulation is a policy, the consent forms that you get from a company are policies as well, which in GDPR speak consist of a declared purpose, that has to be given. So every consent to handle data is for a declared purpose. and allows certain processing, and you have to say something about storage, how long you store data, where you store it, etc. And then basically also which categories of personal data is also an important category. So what do you store, what kind of data? For instance, this GeoJSON I just wrote here, that's just one format to share location data and so on. So where I would say the latter one is maybe not so much in the core of what we do, but it's basically more a data interoperability, data portability interoperability question than related to the transparency and compliance control. So we heard a lot about that in the session yesterday. So what are the different use cases if you think about it in these terms or in these pictograms? I hope you remember from the last slides. So when you think about it from a big company's perspective, a big company has many systems, so especially like big companies which have been merged from different, use different systems and have different customer oriented systems. Many of these companies, when we talk to them, they tell us they want to actually, they would be interested to integrate the data about their customers from these different systems. Now, obviously, they can't do this according to GDPR in an easy way, because they have different systems which collect data for different purposes, where they have separate consent. And why they need interoperability is basically when one of these customers comes and says, I want all your data you have about me and how you processed it. They should be able to process this and not, and they want to do this in an efficient manner. So it would be good if they have one way to log this and deal with GDPR data requests at scale. So that could be one use case. And on the other hand, also, of course, not only to the customer facing, but also to the regulator, they should be able to prove that they handle data in compliance with the consent, that the consent is basically the purpose they use the data for is in compliance with the purpose that was given in the consent, etc. So, and then the question is also in what format would they give out this data? Okay. So similar for small companies might not even have the infrastructure themselves to do all this logging. They might be looking for third-party services to provide this infrastructure. For instance, in a cloud service that can basically do this logging for them. And then we need actually interoperable interfaces, how they could log what they're doing with the data, to which purposes they use it, what consent they have, etc. And so you see the use cases are quite similar, but they all require semantic interoperability at these levels. So that's why we think these core components are important. And in a way, for us at least, semantic interoperability boils down to what's the common core to address these use cases and how do we benefit them all at the same time. So to this end, we organized the W3c W3c supported workshop in April in Vienna on data privacy controls and vocabularies. The outcome of which was roughly some scoping of what we could talk about in terms of standardization. So what we want is kind of a minimal core taxonomy of regulatory privacy terms, a minimal core of personal data categories, core of if you want to say, basically more or less exhaustive but general categories of purposes, which could then further be refined for specific companies and use cases and domains. Taxonomy of disclosure and processing methods, so what does that mean? And then also other metadata, for instance, processing details of anonymization, provenance details when data has been given to third parties, etc. And then also kind of a base vocabulary maybe for logs. So what do you put in those logs to store privacy, where you can easily get it out and answer such privacy data access requests. So some more things were discussed, for instance, taxonomy of human behavior. I think that is basically something which came also from you. So basically, which activities or which things can you derive from personal data? So all these things are what came out of this workshop, and to this end, we founded then W3c Community Group to talk about this. And what's the special thing about a community group? It's not like this one standardization body like the W3c wants to put a new standard, but it's basically we try to get a community together of all people who work in standards in the related area and talk about what is already out there, how can we actually align this in a minimal way to address this use case I was telling you about. So the idea is to start from concrete use cases coming from different projects, coming from different companies, and existing vocabularies that they are all using and align these core vocabularies. So even that's just what we connected already now. So we started the working group already. We had some regular calls, and that's kind of some input we got. And actually, this is not a complete list. Even if you go to the website, I added some more. So I think Coel was not there yet. So, but I put it there now. So we have lots of vocabularies and standards to start with. So we have to talk about which parts of these core components those cover, where they could be used as a starting point. And we want to then think about how we can minimally address the core use cases coming from the stakeholders in the working group. This group is open. We want to ask also, maybe you can put it on screen now for further input. What do you think are more things we forgot? Would you be willing to participate, describe them to us, and help us to align that? And what are the use cases we might not have covered yet? So please join, please let us know, and we need your inputs to make something useful here. Yeah? So what we have done in our project to do this is basically we have 3 use cases, one of which Ben will be talking about, and we have started with some core which covers our needs. And that is what Ben will be speaking about in the second half of the talk. But please feel free to add and join, and maybe we can talk about it a bit more in the open space session. Let's see. So.
Hello, I'm Ben Smith. I work at Thomson Reuters, and we are involved with Axel in a research project about automating compliance to the GDPR in big data environments. There are 3 industry partners in this project. Thomson Reuters, we're looking at Know Your Customer services, which are those services where there are large transactions in the banking industry, where the banks need to know who are doing the transactions and to check whether there's any risk of money laundering or other such regulatory risk. Proximus is Belgium's main telecoms incumbent. They are looking at creating a recommendation engine for their subscribers, basically looking at TV viewing, web browsing, and then providing recommendations for tourists visiting the Belgian coast based on that kind of analytics. And Telecom looking at improving their service quality monitoring. At the moment that's all done with anonymized aggregated data, but they can get much better results if they can actually track individuals. So how can we do these 3 things and stay compliant with GDPR? All of these things are done at scale, so we need an automated solution. And fundamentally, there's one solution that underpins all of these use cases. Every piece of processing requires permissioning. So you must have a permission to do this processing, and that permission must be compliant with the GDPR. So if we have machine-readable descriptions of the permission and of the GDPR, we can do an automated compliance test. And this strange symbol here basically means, is this permission subsumed in the description of the GDPR? It's a subsumption test, which we can do at speed. And then the permissions, once we start analysing the data we've got, is this permission that we're exercising compliant with the consent given by the data subject? And again, it's a fast subsumption check. So compliance can be defined as a logical operation that we can run at speed. So this is a look at the Thomson Reuters use case, and it looks as if we need 6 permissions to do a Know Your Customer check. The first piece of processing we would do would be to take documentary evidence, identity, and generate identity attributes, name, date of birth, such things. Then we have to store those attributes. Then we use them to screen against mandated data sets. So are you on a sanctions list or a law enforcement list? Then we have to validate those results. Then we have to store, share, and generate risk flags from those results. and then we share and store the risk assessment that we then build from that. And if we look at some of these terms, documentary evidence, identity attributes, store, screen, validate, store, share, store. These all begin to look like common terms to run across all use cases, so there's some space here for a common vocabulary. And yet some of these terms look quite domain specific, things like risk flags. That's probably not going to be shared by the Proximus or Deutsche Telekom use cases. These are quite domain specific terms, but so whether that would come into a common vocabulary or not, that's to be debated. And then, if we can show completeness and correctness of execution, i.e. that we are doing those compliance checks, checking those permissions against the GDPR and then those permissions against consent, we can decentralize the holding of personally sensitive information. Because then we can do all the subsumption checks, the compliance checks in smart contracts, if we implement this on the blockchain. So effectively, we can implement all the checks here, which then enable the analytics on the data in some kind of cloud-based environment. So this is the attraction to us of being able to decentralize the holding of personally sensitive information is A, it means perhaps we don't need to hold any, which would be very attractive, and two, it potentially builds the basis of a market in trading personally sensitive information, where compliance in the GDPR is guaranteed by smart contracts. So then what to standardize? Again, I'm going to basically, I'll say much the same as Axel. There is a core logic here. That compliance check is a logical operation. And we want to know that that operation is complete, i.e. it will always provide an answer, and it is correct, so that every answer given is always correct. So we probably want to standardize that logic. Then there is clearly a core vocabulary, which we began to see in that use case. And then perhaps the actual services themselves, so that the algorithms or whatever that sit behind those services are also standardized, not just the vocabularies. And again, what criteria do we want to standardize? We need to maintain completeness and correctness against any changes to the logic, the vocabulary, or the services. And we also need to drive market adoption, and which is one of the reasons why we might want to standardize the services, because that means it makes it much easier for the market to adopt these kinds of solutions. And back to Axel.
Okay, unfortunately, the phone switch here. Anyway, so what we basically, how we implement this in the sense of what I told you before in these core concepts was basically that we have defined some core vocabularies where we take already inputs from existing vocabularies for the policy language. So we have basically split up policies into these core parts: purposes, processing, storage, methods and durations, where we basically see whether the declared in the consent complies with what is in the log. About the processing, we take inputs, core concepts from, for instance, the processing actions from ODRL. Already we take a core set of purposes from P3P, which we're sure that needs to be extended. So, but we have already looked into parts of things that are already existing. For roles, for instance, we take also P3P. But there is definitely more input we want, and we need to for that. So, for instance, for process or for purposes, the activities of tracking, like for COAL, could be some valuable input, and data categories, etc. So we basically just at the moment we do like define in the project some own namespaces. We have to decide then in the working group what we want to do, whether we want to basically say we want to define a conglomerate of vocabularies, whether we want to basically just say we do a JSON LD profile or something like that for people who don't like this RDF-ish version of doing things. I don't care so much about the syntactic format. It's basically something which should be useful for everybody for interchanging these core concepts. So just to have an example of something which we would think of what then this should serve for is basically that you have a natural language policy which is given, for instance. This is something coming out of the use case that Ben was describing, that a data controller will collect financial and judicial information from public sources and analyze it for know your customer purposes, and this information will be stored on the controller servers, let's say maybe also for a specific time, and released to specific third parties, which are not detailed here, but would be in the full policy. So what would be, for instance, the third parties allowed. So, and that basically means that you will basically have to describe these things in terms of agreed upon terms in this hierarchy. That is how it would look like in OWL, essentially, so that you have here the different parts. You have the data is financial and judicial data, that basically where then there would be a specific definition what this includes in this hierarchy. Then that's the data use case is collecting from public data sources, and the purpose is this know your customer analytics. And then basically, so you see here like these orange terms are something which would be specific. So basically companies like Thomson Reuters could refine like core terms which we would define, so we would not define all the terms that go down into a level of detail. We would like to basically have overall categories which are the core terms in this vocabulary, and then basically allow for certain use cases or for certain domains to define this in kind of profiles. So that's more or less about it. I've seen already some questions on the screen.io on maybe what's involved, how you can join. So if you want to join the working group, click here. So that's basically where you find information about the working group. At the moment, we have bi-weekly calls. So you can just dial into these calls. If you join, you need a W3c member account. You need it's a public account, so you can just, you don't need to be a W3c member. Your organization doesn't need to be for community groups. You can just apply for this free account and then join the working group. And then if you have time, join these calls. Somebody asked whether some face-to-face meetings are already planned, whether something is planned at TPAC at W3c. So at the moment we plan to have a face-to-face meeting around the Big Data Value Association Forum in Vienna. So that's in November, I think. I can basically then make available those dates. I don't know it by heart, but if you look for Big Data Value Association, BDVA, then you will find the date range sometime in November in Vienna. Okay, so I hope we have more time to discuss this in the open space session or in the discussion afterwards. I don't know how we are with questions now.